Welcome to this meeting on Marxism versus identity politics. Our speaker today is Esme Choonara, who is on the editors board of the International Socialism Journal, writer of The Rebel's Guide to Trotsky. He's also contributed to our pamphlet on white privilege, privilege theory. And she's going to be speaking for about 30 minutes, and afterwards there'll be a chance for discussion. So, Esme, if you'd like to take it away.
Thank you for that welcome, and good morning to everybody, and welcome if it's your first day at the festival. The context for why we're having this meeting isn't just an abstract debate about identity politics versus Marxism and which one can score the most points. The context for this meeting is a world in which we're seeing a very frightening rise of the far right and racist forces around the world. There aren't just racist forces that are galvanising arguments against trans people or pushing back women's rights, rights for gay, lesbian, all LGBT plus people. So this is the context, and I want you to bear this in mind when we go through the meeting and we start to weigh what the different strategies are for fighting to change that world. And my plan with this meeting is I'm going to talk at the beginning a bit about how we can understand what identity politics is. It's a very broad term, and I'm going to try and give a few pointers about how I think it's useful to understand it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of using identity politics, and then I'm going to come on to talk a bit more about a Marxist critique of that, and why I think Marxism, it'll be no surprise that a festival called Marxism offers us in many ways a better guide to how to navigate some of the challenges that we face. But before I talk about identity politics, I want to just say something about the question of identity itself. And while I'm doing this, you might want to sit there and think to yourself, if I said to you, what are the 2-3 most important things about your identity? I would be genuinely interested to know what people come up with. We haven't got time for that conversation now, but we might have time for that conversation later. And I ask this question because identity really matters to us, doesn't it? Identity speaks to how we feel about ourselves, our relationship to the world, the groups that we belong to, the groups that we're excluded from. It's a very important part of how we live, how we act, how we think, who we are. And although it feels often like a very personal matter, we know that identity isn't personal, just personal. It can be very personal, but it doesn't exist and it isn't created in a vacuum. It involves identification with collectives. It involves that sense of belonging or rejection that I've already talked about. And we don't just choose our identities. They are shaped by the social and the economic and the political forces of the world in which we live. Which is the reason why, even if we choose to downplay elements of our identity, other people may choose to assert it on us. This is one of the reasons why ethnicity and so-called race becomes so important in a world that is shaped by racism, where actually what your supposed race is not a term that I agree with, it's an invention, but your supposed race or ethnicity can determine everything about your education, your relationship with the criminal justice system, how you're seen in popular culture, lots of different things, but it can also affect how you feel about yourself or about how other people see you, whether you want them to or not, and whether it's important to you or not. It becomes important in the world because of the social context. Or conversely, there are people who want to police our identities, and sometimes literally police our identities. You think about the battles for trans rights at the moment, which is about people saying there are certain identities that aren't valid. And so all of us are part of that fight to say that actually those identities are valid, that if you're trans or you're non-binary, these are valid, important identities that we want to fight for the right to express them. So identity itself is political and is contested. And this is one of the reasons why identity politics comes into being in the first place. And I think when we say what is identity politics, at its most basic, identity politics really means any attempt to organise on the basis of a claimed shared identity and experience. And I say claimed because I'm going to come on to some of the controversies about who's in and who's out with different identities in a minute. But it's been used to describe so many different phenomena that it becomes difficult sometimes to grapple with the concept of identity politics, because it's been used to describe the rise of Trump, of right-wing populism, of Brexit, of political Islam, of nationalism, and all sorts of struggles against oppression, including the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements. And actually, when you think about it, most political struggles involve a sense, creating a sense of us and them. We have to, we might disagree about who the us is and who the them is, but actually all politics really involves a little bit of a sense of an identity, of trying to say, they're the enemy, this is our target, and we're the people, whatever that grouping is, who are going to fight it. So you see elements of this kind of emerging out of all struggles. But traditionally, and the sorts of identity politics that I'm really going to focus on, is the way in which identity politics has been used to describe movements against oppression, against prejudice, against injustice, against discrimination. And the term really first became used on the left in the 1970s in relation to some of the social movements against racism, for gay liberation, against women's oppression. And then I think you see in the 1980s that kind of becoming a more individualised version of identity politics that fitted very much with neoliberalism at the time, that the focus became much more on the individual. I think again that's shifted again now with Black Lives Matter, Me Too, much more outward-looking, forward-looking collective movements. But interesting to think about some of that history, and if we have time we can talk about that more. But I think also it's worth saying that more recently we've also seen not just the evolution of left-wing anti-oppression identity politics, but also we've seen the growth of a right-wing narrative, which is not new, but which has gained ground, I would say, in recent years, particularly with Trump. The idea of a left-behind white working class, where the emphasis is on the white, as if the working class has only ever been white and only involves white people. And this is a kind of anti-identity politics, by which the right wing will say the real problem here is all this work to tackle racism and sexism and to think about gender and to think about sexuality has all gone too far, and it's left behind these poor white working class people. And that is a form of identity politics, but it's a kind of anti-identity politics, if you like, and it's the identity politics of the right wing. And you'll notice in that whole narrative that while the working class is always white, people of colour never have a class, are classless. It's a very interesting narrative, and if we have time we can unpick that a bit more. But you can also see right-wing identity politics. I think if you think about the struggle around Palestine and the way in which Zionism has tried to assert itself as the true identity of all Jewish people. And I'm not going to talk about this in this meeting because there are many meetings about Palestine and about the myths of Zionism and how to tackle that across Marxism. But I think it's worth thinking about this phenomena of what the right wing are doing with identity politics. And the reason I raise all of this is because there is some people who equate left-wing and identity politics with right-wing identity politics. In fact, there are some people who go further and blame the left-wing identity politics for creating the political terrain on which the right-wing can raise its own identity politics. And there are lots of people, and I know there's another meeting after this one in this course that's going to look at this in more detail, but I saw this when I read Francis Fukuyama wrote a book, the US economist wrote a book quite a few years ago now about identity, and he makes exactly this argument. And more recently, the writer Marx James Leger made this argument in his book about identity politics. And I think we should reject this, and I know there'll be more about this in the next meeting, so I won't go on about it, but we have to reject this equation of right-wing politics, which is there to try and drive back all the gains that the liberation movements have won, with left-wing politics, which is about liberation, and however much we might disagree with left-wing identity politics, is at least fighting for positive and progressive change, and we shouldn't equate the two. And so I want to move on to say some things about the positives or the potential positives of organising around questions of identity and the way in which identity politics has manifested itself. And the first thing that I want to say is that resistance is good. And I think that the Marxist position, and the position of anybody who calls himself a leftist or a progressive, should never be, when people are fighting back, to sit back on the sidelines and just say, oh, but you're doing it all wrong. Actually, when people fight back, that is a powerful thing, and we want people to fight back. And whatever tools they find, ideologically or collectively or politically, to fight back with, our starting point is that resistance is good. Capitalism only survives because there isn't enough collective resistance and there isn't enough targeted resistance, and resistance is so important. So when I critique identity politics, I'm starting from a fraternal position in which the first step has to be resistance. But because the tasks that we face are so important, that means that no form of resistance isn't without discussion. But we can't give ourselves the right to have those discussions and debates unless we're on the right side to start with and we're involved in those struggles and we're not just giving people conditions and telling them they're doing everything wrong. But there are lots of strengths of identity politics, and we can see them throughout history. The idea that you gather people on the basis of shared injustice to demand change can create a powerful sense of unity. It can force change, it can change the political agenda, it can change the terrain, and it can actually make people who face oppressions feel differently about those oppressions themselves. You think about the Black Power movement, not just that fought back racism, but also that it changed the political agenda, that it won lots of gains, but also it changed the way that people felt about themselves as black people. Really, really powerful stuff. And that lasts really, I think, to the ideas around black is beautiful today. Or you think about the gay liberation movement or the women's movement in the 1960s and the 1970s. And I think it's really important that we remember that when we're talking about these questions about struggle and identity, struggle also changes our sense of identity. Today, while we're having this meeting, Pride is happening in London as well, and the whole idea of a movement that is called Pride says to you that there is something here about people being proud of who they are, that this is an important and valid part of our movement and our struggles against injustice and for dignity as well. And so I think we always have to think there are potential strengths to identity politics, and we have to defend them against the right who just want to push back against gains and keep oppressed people in our place. But let's talk more. I'm sure we'll agree about that. So let's talk more about some of the limitations and some of the challenges and some of the historic problems of trying to organise on the basis of a shared identity. And I think the first thing to say about that is that actually organising on the basis of identity doesn't remove the need for strategy. It doesn't give you the answers. Just having the same identity as other people doesn't tell you the best way to challenge the powerful system that we face. And what do I mean by this? So I've been involved in the anti-racist struggle for decades now, and actually I've seen many different strategies on offer based on organising around the question of identity. You know, do we need black faces in high places? I think with the last Tory government, I think we've seen that we really don't need black faces in high places. But the idea of black-owned businesses was a very strong argument in the most recent wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. Do we need to focus on black-owned businesses and buying our way out of oppression? Do we need radical revolutionary politics? Do we need to think not about black-owned businesses, but more about the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers? Do we need to think about only those who suffer an oppression can be part of the fight against it, or do we think other people can be part of that fight against it? How should we relate to the state? How should we relate to corporations? Should we be trying to find a way to promote black people within those institutions, or should we be organising outside of them to smash those institutions? So there are lots of strategic questions about how to organise that are not solved just by organising on the basis of identity politics. And this is why identity politics is so broad, because there are so many different ways to do this. And actually sometimes identity politics can make it harder to find a strategy that works, because it can hide divisions that exist among groups. You know, I mentioned jokingly the Tory cabinet, but actually the idea that not all people of colour are consistent anti-racists is quite an important point, that we are divided by class, the same as anyone else. You think about the situation of Muslims in this world. In Britain, there are something like 10,000 Muslim millionaires. in Britain. I think it's that number. I can check the number if you like. But the vast majority of Muslims in Britain are among some of the poorest people, the most exploited at work, in lower paid jobs. And so there's a massive division between those people, and there's a different interest in whether you prop up the system or whether you confront the system. So we have to think about there are divisions. The other thing that I think we have to say while we're talking about black conservatives is that we have to distinguish between top-down identity politics and bottom-up identity politics. Because you see, I think neoliberalism is really happy, and neoliberal capitalism actually in many ways encourages certain forms of identity politics. Those sorts of identity politics that don't actually challenge the status quo or the power of various structures. And I think we saw this after Black Lives Matter, didn't we, with a whole number of corporations jumping on board, at least performatively, with saying that they were behind the movement, of displaying slogans for Black Lives Matter, saying that they were going to put more people on their board of directors, of saying that they were going to do, but not actually challenging any of the structural questions about where people are positioned within the workforce, or you think about the public institutions. I work in the NHS, you think about all the NHS leaders who came out to say this is really important, and yet actually addressing the question of low pay in the NHS, where the lowest pay workers are predominantly black, where the people who face the biggest numbers of disciplinaries and most likely to be sacked are black, without challenging those structural problems. Top-down identity politics really is just leaving those things in a vacuum. And actually, in some ways, the top-down identity politics that talk about diversity, notice here how the corporate language has shifted from equality, from social justice, to talking about diversity. A power-free description of inequality, if you like, in diversity, that everybody's the same, and we should just recognise other people's difference, but there's no sense of actually the injustice of how different people are treated. And one of the problems with top-down identity politics is that it actually does give space to certain commentators to say that identity politics, that the struggle against racism is really a concern of the elite, and that this misses out the concerns of ordinary working class people. And this is an argument that we absolutely reject, because we believe that anti-racism, the struggle for gay sexual liberation, for women's liberation, is a concern of all working class people, and I'll come on to say more about that now. But that's one of the problems with top-down identity politics, and why we should focus our support on identity politics from below. A couple more things that I wanted, contradictions, challenges that I want to draw out with regard to identity politics. One of them I've already kind of hinted at, and that's the question of authenticity. So if you're organising on the basis of a shared identity, who is it who gets to choose who is in and out of that identity? You think about the massive assault that there's been from certain feminists against trans women that have been trying to police who gets to be called a woman and who gets to be part of the women's movement. So these things are not always progressive, and they're not always things that we would agree with. But also, I'm somebody of mixed ethnicity, of mixed heritage, and I think for many of us, we're very aware of this idea of there are different categories of some people consider us black, some people don't consider us black. We're all of mixed heritage, by the way, all of you, just in case you're a bit shocked by that. In case any of you are like living, I don't know, is there an island where Vikings live? It will only ever be Vikings. I think it's unlikely. We're all of mixed heritage, so you might as well just get used to that. But this whole question of who gets to be black is a very contested terminology for the Socialist Workers' Party, like for several of the trade unions in Britain, and historically for the movement in Britain. Black means people who have a shared heritage that has experienced slavery or colonialism, and that today faces racism. But that's not the case for lots of people. There are other people. We were having a discussion with Hindi Andrews last night, who's got a different version of what blackness is. There are other people who say that black people are only people who are from Africa, but there are some people who say, but not people who are from East Africa. So there are lots of debates about who gets to be in and who gets to be out of these. And these are not just technical questions. Again, I remember not the most recent wave of Black Lives Matter movement, but the wave before that in Britain a few years ago, there was a really big argument that became actually really destructive in the Black Lives Matter movement about whether Asian people could be part of the organising or leadership of Black Lives Matter. And it just became really destructive and really divisive. So these things can actually set the movement back if they're not handled in a way that's useful. So there's this question of who gets to make those decisions. And sometimes the state makes those decisions. And this is one of the things we have to be really wary of, is where the state is deciding who are the community leaders that they will do business with because they want to hold them up as representing a whole community. Who really gets to speak for our communities? That's another question I'd put out there. And I think one of these problems with authenticity is that it tends to essentialise things that are actually very fluid. You think about the concept of whiteness, for example. In 1890, if you were Portuguese and you moved to Guyana, you would find that you were classified as non-white. But if you had a twin who emigrated that same year to America, she would find that she was categorised as white. These categories are made up, race is invented, and that means all races are invented, including the whole concept of whiteness. Frantz Fanon wrote in his book Black Skins, White Masks, "My black skin is not the wrapping of specific values." In other words, don't assume what somebody's politics are, their strategy is, their personality is, just from the way in which they appear or what you think you know about their identity. And the other problem I think we can say historically with identity politics is that it can be prone to fragmentation. Because it starts to grapple with these divisions about who's in and who's out, sometimes that can create arguments, it can become demobilising, particularly when movements are on the way down again, or they come up against the power of the state, or they go into decline. They can tend to really look inwards about what's dividing them rather than what's uniting people. And this has some implications for how we organise. And the one that I really want to talk about is about this question of the primacy of experience that I think is really written into identity politics. A lot of identity politics is really based on the idea that only people who experience a particular discrimination, oppression, injustice can lead a fight or can understand or can have the right to speak about that oppression that they face. And I want to start by saying I'm not dismissive of this argument. Lived experience is very important. It's often what motivates us. If you think about what's brought you here today, it's probably either things that you've experienced or things that you've seen that have really angered or upset you. And actually our experiences of an unjust world and having to fight for the right to speak out, to find our voice, to be who we want to be, to just get through life sometimes, are often what motivate us to become political, to draw conclusions that we need to organise to change. So experience can be very powerful. And there are voices, because of the way that discrimination, injustice, oppression work under capitalism, that have been excluded. And so therefore I do think we have to find space in our movement to hear the experiences of black people, of women, of trans people, of people with disabilities, of all sorts of different people, because they bring a richness to our movement and a wider understanding of how our world is working. But I think it's also important to say that lived experience shouldn't give people the moral authority on a particular question. And why do I say this? Well, firstly, because there is no one experience that captures what it is to be a woman, that captures what it is to be a black person, that captures even what it is to be a black woman. There is no one experience that can seek to claim to represent all of that whole group of people for all the reasons that I've talked about. None of us has this exact same experience, so we have to try and find what is it from our experience that can link us into a wider fight that is useful, that we want to hear. But also, I think it's important that we say that suffering doesn't always create insight. Suffering can do lots of things. It can create the will to fight back, but it can also break people. Or it can give us a partial vantage point on what's going on in the world. It doesn't necessarily give us enough tools to see the whole picture. And this isn't just Marxists saying this. Olufemi Otaiwo puts it really well in his book, Elite Capture. He writes, "Pain, whether born of oppression or not, is a poor teacher. Suffering is partial, short-sighted and self-absorbed. We shouldn't have a politics that expects different." In other words, the experience of oppression, while it's important and very powerful to our movements often, is not a substitute for the strategy, the discussion, the sorts of things we're doing at Marxism, for actually talking among ourselves about how we're going to fight and trying things out in action. And my final point really is that we've got to think, what is the change? Then my final point on this is, what is the change that we want? I talked about the different strategies. I think we have to have some clarity about what it is that we're fighting for. And one of the ways that I like to think about this is, again, this is not an abstract question. Let's think about what the alternatives to identity politics are. And for me, the alternative to identity politics is organising on a broad unity against all of the oppressions that we face. Now, which of those strategies do we think is the most likely to work? I think back to last summer, where I think the left was posed with one of the biggest challenges that I've had in my lifetime, where we saw the far-right pogroms against refugees, attempting to burn down hostels, a really frightening summer for all of us. And actually, I live in Walthamstow. I have the absolute honour to live in a town, a borough, that actually turned out 10,000 people against the far right when the far right came to Walthamstow. I'm not taking responsibility for that, by the way. I was a small part of that, just to make that clear. But I think this is a test, because if that turnout had been determined just by identity politics, in other words, you could only organise, or you could only come to the protest, or the best way to organise or the best way to come to the protest was if you faced that direct assault. So if you were a refugee, or wording it more slightly, if you were a Muslim. Actually, on the day, I had lots of my Muslim friends and colleagues and comrades texting me to say, is it safe to come out in the streets of Walthamstow? Is it safe? And this is one of the other problems with identity politics, is why should we put that responsibility onto the people who are most at threat? The responsibility should be taken by everybody to counter the far right. And actually, because we built on a broadest possible base, that we wanted black, white, Muslim, trade unions, we wanted everybody on the streets, it gave space to Muslims to turn up, for black people to be on the streets, for people to feel safe. And so actually that broad-based unity proved in practice that this is a more effective way to organise and to fight. Now, I've just about run out of time, but I have to say some things about Marxism. And I think one of the key things I have to say is that there are some key conceptual differences at the roots of identity politics versus Marxism. And this is about where oppression and inequality come from, because I think various forms of identity politics tend to see a multiplicity of oppressions, sometimes understood as interlocking or intersectional, but coming from different places, running in parallel, sometimes crossing over, and having different causes and trajectories. And that's often based on how things feel or how they appear, aren't they? You know, if you're a woman, you tend to experience sexism from men, don't you? If you're white, if you're black, you tend to experience racism from white people and so on. You can see why people feel that there are different stratifications and different kind of trajectories of how these oppressions run side by side and interlock as well. But Marx wrote in Capital that all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. In other words, the whole point of Marxism is to look below the surface and try and work out what are the patterns, what's the root of this, what's really going on here. And so for us as Marxists, our concept of oppression is not that it's lots of things running in parallel that come from different places and are going to different places, but that we can trace a common root, and that common root is class society, and in particular capitalist society, where you can see the roots of racism in slavery, where you can see the oppression of women and gay people, you can see trans oppression, disabled oppression, all of those, you can see them linked into and perpetuated by the capitalist system. And that then leads us to the question of whether Marxism has the ability to theoretically deal with the concepts of oppression. And I think it's really important that we understand that Marxism is a living theory, it's an evolving theory, and it can always be expanded and applied to the real world. There are caricatures of Marxism that say that Marxism is everything that was written in the great book by Marx and in the great book by Lenin, and people tend to add whoever their other favourites are, and that that's all we need in order to understand the world. That's not a real Marxist account. A real Marxist account is to take the insights of all that work and apply it to the world in which we live. So there's always room for Marxism to develop. And that's one of the things that we try and do at this festival. However, I think it would be wrong to caricaturise Marxism as never having, or Marx, as not dealing with the questions of oppression, because Marxism has always incorporated questions of oppression. Marx's whole worldview about understanding the rise of capitalism was how it was interlinked with the rise of slavery, and he made that very clear in his key economic writings in Capital, where he talked about the brutality of the system, both at home and in the colonies, and he talked about the brutality of slavery. He also wrote about the divide and rule between British workers and Irish immigrants in Britain. He took the right side on the question of the anti-colonial struggles in India. Other Marxists have later added to this whole body of work. You think about the work that Claudia Jones did, writing about the triple oppression faced by black working class women years before identity politics or intersectionality became terms on the left. So Marxism has a worldview that can incorporate, has an analysis, and from its very beginning has grappled with the questions of how capitalism produces and reproduces and uses questions of oppression. But I want to finish on this question of, the question of what specifically Marxists have to say, not just about broad unity, but about where the power lies to unlock and destroy the system that creates and perpetuates all these divisions, inequalities and oppressions. Because I talked about the fantastic march in Walthamstow. It's not the first time we've marched in Walthamstow against the far right. And I do not want to be doing this every 10 years or however long it is, or it's probably accelerating now. We can march, we can demonstrate, we can show that we have opposition, but we have to think more strategically. We have to think, where is the power to not just push this back, or not just to show our opposition, but to actually demolish the system. And that's why Marxists talk about class. It's not the caricature that is given of Marxists, that we think that there are all these divisions in society and class is the most important one. That's not what we think. It's not that we see these all the same. For Marxists, we understand that there are lots of different oppressions, and all of them are very important to combat, partly because struggle is ineffective unless we overcome the divisions that exist between us. But actually, the reason that Marxists talk about class is not because we think class is a special thing, but because actually we're looking for where is the economic relationship. What is the difference between oppression, the prejudices, the discriminations that exist under capitalism, and the question of exploitation, by which people who are working class have profit extracted from them, that the majority of people in the world are part of a global working class that creates all the wealth that exists. So for us, for Marxists, class is not about identity. It's not about how you feel about yourself. It's not about what accent you use. And you read all sorts of nonsense about this, about class, don't you? The best one I ever read was that working class people are people who can eat peas off a knife. And apparently that's like a real thing. I don't know. Anyway, try it when you go home. There are all sorts of nonsense sociological categories about what class is, that you can only be class if you're in a manual job, and all the rest of it. For Marxists, class is not an identity, although people identifying with their class is an important concept in Marxism. But for us, class is an economic relationship in which the majority of people are exploited. And that's why when Marx talked about the universal, called the working class the universal class, it was not because we all have the same experiences or identities, it was because we all share a collective interest in overthrowing capitalism, and by so doing, being able to challenge racism, sexism and all the rest of it. That doesn't mean that other struggles are put on a back burner, and that should be clear to anybody who's at Marxism, that we're at the forefront of all of the battles for trans rights, over Palestine, over many, many different things, because a class struggle is not possible unless we're also fighting that battle against the divisions that exist on our side, against racism, against sexism, against homophobia, against all of those different things. So it doesn't mean ignoring questions of identity. Those things can be really important, but they're not enough for the strategy which we need in order to win. And actually, I think for Marxists, our basic position is that none of us are free unless all of us are free. But for all of us to be free, we have to look at where the power lies to make that happen. And that lies with the economic power, not just the political power, but the economic power that the working class has to transform society. Well, thank you everybody for a really good discussion, which I hope will continue throughout the day. And if you're interested, there are further meetings on this topic in this course running in the next session, the session after that, well, throughout the whole of Marxism, really. A couple of observations, and then I just want to get into an overall question of strategy. The observations, really, a couple of things. One is somebody mentioned social media. And I do want to say something about social media because I think a lot of the worst aspects of identity politics play out in social media, where people post things that they would never say to other people in actual face-to-face conversations, and try and shut down discussions that people are having or take moral authority over a discussion that's happening on social media. And I think we have to say social media is a very contradictory thing, isn't it? There are some brilliant advances from the fact that we can see what's happening in other parts of the world, we can communicate with each other, we can mobilise. There are lots of brilliant things about it. But actually organising on social media is not a substitute for actually getting out and challenging the structures of power. And so when I'm talking about our strategies, I'm not talking about our social media strategy. I'm talking about our get out on the streets, get out on the picket lines, get out and actually confront the institutions of power strategy. But I think it's something that we need to think about, is why is the discussion so toxic on social media in a way that it isn't always face-to-face, where we can have these discussions in meetings with other people. The second thing that let's go on to the real substance of this discussion, really. And what I wanted to start by saying is, I think it's really important that we understand that, a bit like Nadia was explaining, the second to last contribution, was actually the fight against oppression, the fight against racism, against sexism, against all these divisions, are not in and of themselves identity politics. Identity politics is just one of the ways that people might be fighting against these things. There are actually lots of different strategies, and my argument in this session has been that while identity politics can bring lots of different people to the movement in different ways, actually I think Marxists have a better strategy than identity politics, because I think our ideas equip us better with how to fight these things. And what do I mean by this? Every single battle that we face involves, whether it's explicit or hidden, a discussion or a thought process or a strategic answer about how we're going to fight to change that, whether it's an instance of racism, whether it's the whole system, whether it's a specific dispute, whether it's over trans rights. And you can either say that the only people who can fight over that issue are the people who are directly affected by it, and that's identity politics. Or you can say the only people who can fight over it are those who are directly affected by it, plus their allies. But the whole concept of allyship, which we're going to talk about in some later meetings, and I hope people will go to the meeting with Emma Tabiri, who wrote this brilliant book on it, who criticises the concept of allyship, because we can do better than allyship. The idea of allyship is that only those who are affected by something can fight for it, but that they can also have like a secondary layer of allies who can fall in behind them. Now, actually Marxists say we can do something better than this. We believe that whether it's sexism, transphobia, racism, whatever the oppression is, we believe that we can build a mass united movement against that oppression. And not just out of sympathy. This is one of the things that I hate about allyship. It suggests that if you're not affected by something, you can only join it out of either guilt or sympathy. Actually, I think the concept of solidarity should be injected into this discussion. That actually we believe that you can build a mass movement against racism that involves black and white, Asian, brown, all sorts of different people, not just out of sympathy, but because we believe that racism harms everybody in the working class. We believe that white people in the working class also have an interest in fighting against racism, because racism divides us, it creates scapegoats, it hides the real problems of capitalism, it makes us much weaker to fight, it drags down everybody's wages, it drags down everybody's living conditions. Now, we know that black people and Asian people suffer the most under racism, but they're not the only people who have an interest in challenging it. So when we say you can build a broad movement, that's because we have the politics to say that there is a united interest in challenging it. And that's why I think Marxism has something very specific to bring to these movements of change. And somebody with an amazing fox tattoo said earlier that they were for reform and revolution. And actually, I think revolutionaries make the best reformists because we actually have something to say about the strategy. Our goal is revolution, but that revolutionary vision is what tells us how to fight in every battle we face. In every battle we face, in every strike, in every campaign, there's an argument about strategy. And our strategy is always, we can build it mass. We can build mass movements. We believe other people will join this fight. We believe that we can win them. But also we link that to the power, the economic power that working class people have, and that's why we try and bring the weight of the working class movement into every battle we're part of. And I think the comrade who spoke from France, I think France illustrates this really well, and I think it's absolutely true. I've been in France recently, that there is a very divided movement where the trade unions, mostly white people in trade union movements, protest, and then there are mostly Muslims left to fight alone against Islamophobia and over the question of Palestine. It's a divided movement, and that comes back to me to a failure of politics on the French left at the very beginning of Islamophobia to say that Islamophobia is racism and to take it up seriously as a class issue. And I think that's one of the differences that we have made as a left in Britain here. We would never let Muslims in Britain fight alone over Palestine, over Islamophobia, over scapegoating, over any of it. So we need two things, don't we? We need a broad-based movement in the way that I've talked about and the way that lots of you have talked about how we fought for that in practice. And we need to fight for that and we need to keep fighting for it. But we need within that a political strand that can help us navigate that. And I believe that Marxists, revolutionary socialists, have the best ability to do that. I think identity politics isn't just an organisational form. I think as David said earlier in the meeting, it also becomes a kind of common sense in the movements that we're grappling with. And we have to have the clarity of politics to see beyond that. And that means not just having the broad-based movements, but having a core of revolutionary socialists who hold true to the idea that every oppression is a blow to all of us, and that none of us will be free until all of us are free, that we're going to fight on every single front, but that we are going to link that to a politics of revolution that looks to the economic power that our class can have globally to transform the whole of the system, and so that we're not just fighting those movements over and over again, that we can actually have a vision of a socialist society where all of us can be free, we can have real liberation, and none of us are facing the oppressions that we face, and we can fight for genuine liberation. And if you agree with that, join the Socialist Workers' Party. That's what we're fighting for.